of a sudden I'm having all of these, I'm in a conservative industry, the steel industry, and I'm having all of these spiritual things happen to me, I'm dead, then I come back, and then Frosty comes and talks to me, and all of these things are happening. And so what happened is that while Dr. Patel was working on me, and all of this is in my medical record, everything that she started to do, the traditional shocks, this vigorous sternal rubs, 4 injections right into the heart of bicarb, all of these things to try to revive me. I had heard another male spirit come into the room and kept on telling Dr. Patel over and over and over again, don't give up, you can save him.
Thanks for watching the Near Death Network here on YouTube. My name is Mark Lewis. I thank you for watching our videos, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And as always, leave us your comments.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of What's Death Got to Do with It here on the Near Death Network. My name is Mark Lewis. I'm the creator, executive producer, and just lover of all things that have to do with near-death consciousness, the extension of life, which I think we incorrectly define now. And you're going to hear another remarkable story today that I think will enlighten you about how life never ends. And it's a very deep, nuanced story. We talk to clinicians and academicians, but today we're going to talk specifically with an experiencer who I have had the pleasure of reading his book, Quarks of Light. Rob Gentile joins us from the other coast. We're on the left coast, you're on the right coast. Rob, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me, Mark. It's a pleasure.
So I think we should start at the beginning, because if somebody looks at your book, and I'll just hold it up here, chapter 1 is very interesting. As we say in our business, it's a tease, right? So you come in, you talk about your experience as a toddler, and you encounter this orb. If you could articulate that, and then we'll circle back to it at some point, because I think it's very cogent with the overall editorial story that you tell.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Most people don't, and I'm glad you did, because there's a fascinating story behind that as it unfolded. But it's kind of interesting. So I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm the first generation son of Italian immigrants, and I was raised in a small steel town. And my father worked in the steel mill. My grandfather worked in the steel mill, and I actually ended up working in the steel mill. And to this day, I remain in the steel industry. Mm. But it's interesting, when my father was working in the mill, he was involved in a terrible industrial accident where he was knocked off of a ledge, and he fell on his back 30 feet down onto a hot molten billet. Oh. And it crushed his kidneys. And, back then, I was born in 59, but back then, there was no dialysis. So my father had led this, like the last 3 years of his life were pretty torturous, and it was a slow poisoning of the body. And I had 3 older brothers, but I hadn't been born yet, but my father always loved children, and my mother went to our local, country doctor and said, what can I do to help my husband out of this depression? And he said, I think that you should have another child. It'll be his joy and his toy to kind of like give him a reason to live. So I was conceived. And I don't get into all of those details in the book, but what had happened to me was extraordinary. So we were in a very, very small 2-bedroom house not far from the steel mill. And I was probably about age 2, and I was laying in my crib one night, and my parents were there speaking Italian. And I always had slept on my back with my palms straight up like this in my crib. And all of a sudden, I noticed that there was this white glowing orb that kind of started to seep through the ceiling. And as that orb began to descend, it turned into a hand. And that hand began to float very, very gently down, almost like a feather would, fall from a tree. And it just placed itself in my hand. And in that moment, it was kind of like sticking your finger in an electric, socket. I kind of absorbed that glowing orb, that white hand, and it was kind of like a shock. And I jumped. My mother tells the story that I had jumped up in the crib and I grabbed onto the rails, and I was laughing uncontrollably, only like a child can do with no preoccupation in his mind. And she said I was just laughing and laughing and laughing. And my father said something in Italian, like, I think he's just having a dream. And she came back and tucked me in, and I fell asleep. But it's kind of interesting that as my life had begun to unfold and all of these things started to happen to me, I realize now, in retrospect, 66 years later, that glowing orb was either the Holy Spirit, I'm Christian, an angel, who knows? But it was a harbinger of things to come. And shortly after, my father had passed away, and I had felt like my identity was gone because I had lost my father. But that glowing orb was always there to give me peace and to help me move forward. So it's kind of interesting that when I wrote the book, I got into a big battle with one of my editors who said, look, you got to take that chapter out of the book because everybody's going to think you're crazy. And that's just not going to work. So either you take it out or we're not going to publish it. So I had to fight hard to keep that chapter in.
I'm glad you did, because I think it's a placeholder for your entire experience, really.
It really is, Mark. And, it's kind of interesting because as after the book was published and people, began to send me emails and reach out to me through my website, they were all saying, hey, I've got a story just like that. I was walking down the street as a child and I fell into this giant hole. There was construction. I didn't see it. And the next thing I know, this light came up from behind me and just threw me back onto the street. And all these fascinating stories that had come from that chapter. So yeah, it was a great place to start. Thank you.
Well, I even had an experience myself personally when I was back in college. I was working up outside of Portland, Oregon, and doing way too much drinking and extracurricular stuff. Drove home one night, had no business being in a car, but I got piloted specifically, not only physically, but mentally. Whomever, I believe it was my angels, and I apologize to them in advance for all of the problem and consternation that I must have caused them. But they literally directed me back to the domicile and to where I was staying. I had a vivid recollection of that, even though I was in an impaired state. So I think we all have those types of stories that transcend what we believe is really life. When you went through and got shown the entire display, you got the full length feature. Some of us get snippets. So let's start back at the causation of the surgery that ultimately would lead to your near-death experience. You had some bone spurs, I believe, on your neck, and you had surgery to correct that?
Exactly. Yes. So I live in North Carolina now, but so I'd had from sports injuries when I was younger. I was involved in martial arts, things like that, and I had these bone spurs on the back of my neck, which were, creating pain, shooting neurological pain down my into my fingers. And so there's this really famous doctor in Pittsburgh, Dr. Joe, who invented his own surgery. It's called a foraminal anatomy. So he goes in through the front. Instead of cutting, the back of your spine open and you're in pain the rest of your life. My wife's a pharmacist, and those are most of her patients. Failed back and neck surgeries. But this guy goes in through the front, cuts you here, and he moves the esophagus aside, and he drills out the spurs from the front. Simple surgery. You're only in the hospital one night. So it was very successful. I came back to North Carolina. And 3 nights later, in my bed, I threw a blood clot, and it went right into my widowmaker, which killed me instantly. So the blood clot.
You talk about in the book, forgive me for interrupting, but for those of us who saw The Exorcist, I mean, Melanie, your wife, articulates that it was almost like a scene out of The Exorcist. You were in so much excruciating pain, correct?
Well, what happened was, so when I started flopping around in the bed and screaming, and my wife didn't know what was going on. I have a special needs child who's nonverbal. She thought it was her, ran down the hall and came back, and it was me. And she calls 911. I had passed out from the pain, and they rushed me to the hospital. She had a neighbor come and watch my daughter, Maria. We get into the hospital, and they knew I was having a massive heart attack, so they gave me whatever kind of medication that is to, calm you down and get blood flow going. And they put me in a room with a nurse and my wife, and the nurse says, because it was like 12 o'clock at night, the cardiologist wasn't in the hospital. The cardiologist was on call. So they said, you'll be stable, you'll be fine until the cardiologist gets here. And then right after she said that, of course, I'm passed out on the gurney. But as soon as she said that, my wife said, I sprang forward on the gurney, almost as if somebody had grabbed me by my shirt and just pulled me straight up from the waist up. And my eyes popped open and I screamed out the name Frosty. And then I collapsed backward and flatlined. So flatline, the nurse, you hear this in the hospital, all these alarms go off, and in comes a team that starts to work on me and tries to revive me. Now, which is in my hospital records, which are made public, but I was dead for 20 minutes.
Wow.
But finally, Dr. Bajwa, who is a Sikh, the cardiologist, finally arrived, did an emergency catheterization, cut my thigh open, found the blockage in the widowmaker, put in 2 stents, but it was too late. I was in cardiogenic shock. I was intubated and went into a 4-day coma. That's how it all started.
Wow. And circle back real quickly, some relevant information about Frosty. Frosty was your brother-in-law? Well, yeah.
Yes. Frosty was my brother-in-law, who unfortunately 7 weeks prior to me having that heart attack that night had taken his own life, sadly. Frosty had struggled with a lot of things in his life, and he was living in the upstairs bedroom of his parents' house. And he had struggled with drugs in the past, but he had been clean for like 5 years. But he was going through a separation and a lot of pressure around the holidays. His daughter was in college. He has one daughter. And he took his own life, and his mother had called me. We only lived like 30 miles from her parents. It was like 5:30 in the morning, and she asked me to come down and to go up into his room and see if I could find a note or a journal or something that would give them a clue as to why he did that. So it's kind of interesting, Mark, because without getting into graphic details, I had to go up into that room. I went up 7 times, actually, and picked through a rather gruesome scene. But I finally found a journal, which I was able to give to the family. But what was curious about that whole experience is my wife, after I had come out of coma, on the 4th day, the doctor had told my wife, he's probably a vegetable. They had sent the parish priest in. I had been given my last rites. I was anointed with oil, and they all thought I was brain dead. So they said, let's pull the tubes out and see what we got here. So obviously I started choking, and the rest is history. But when my wife came into the recovery room, my arms were paralyzed from all the trauma. And she said that I was speaking in this, childlike, high-pitched voice saying, Melanie, you have to believe me. It was Frosty. It was Frosty. He came to me. And she said, oh my God, I can't believe you're telling me this. I said, why? And she said, well, right before you flatlined, you had sprung forward on the gurney and you screamed out his name. And then, you passed out in the flatline. And, it's kind of curious, Mark, because, I was raised Catholic, and and I know they've changed the rules since then. But at that point in time, if in my faith, if you had taken your own life, it was a mortal sin. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was no pass go, straight to hell. You were condemned. But when Frosty came to me, he said this. He said, I made a big mess out of things, and you have to go back and help clean things up. But tell my parents I'm in a good place. Mm. And Frosty had always had severe anxiety, just like he had demons with him all the time. But in that place, he was just peaceful and happy and, filled with light and love. And that was a big paradigm shift in my belief system. I mean, I was 56 years old.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, how can a loving God condemn someone who is going through such a tragic phase in his life? And so, it didn't make any sense to me. So, it was kind of a harbinger. Frosty kind of like kicked the door open and allowed things to come into my heart that had never been there before. The love of God, the love of the Creator, the forgiveness of the Creator. And I was just so delighted to hear that. And it set me on a spiritual path. And it actually laid the foundation for what was going to come while I was awaiting heart transplant, because my heart was completely destroyed at that point.
I think there's a very interesting passage. I mean, there's so many interesting passages in the book, but you talk about Dr. Patel and how influential she was. And you mentioned that you were clinically DOA for 20 minutes. That's for her to continue to persevere, to go through with the machinations of trying to revive you, where a lot of people would have said, okay, call it, he's done. Can you relate that experience? And then tell me, because I was fascinated by this, that you said that you didn't tell her for a year that your father was involved.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, how can you hold on to something like that for a year?
Well, because, all of a sudden I'm having all of these, I'm in a conservative industry, the steel industry, and I'm having all of these spiritual things happen to me. I'm dead, then I come back, and then Frosty comes and talks to me, and all of these things are happening. And so what happened is that while Dr. Patel was working on me, and all of this is in my medical record, everything that she started to do, the traditional shocks, this vigorous sternal rubs, 4 injections right into the heart of bicarb, all of these things to try to revive me. I had heard another male spirit come into the room and kept on telling Dr. Patel over and over and over again, don't give up. You can save him. Don't give up. You can save him. And, it was interesting because when I was in recovery, she was the second one that came into my room after my wife. And Dr. Patel comes in. Of course, I didn't know who she was. I was unconscious the whole time. And beautiful Indian woman. And she pulls up this chair and she sits down beside me. And I'm like, oh, who are you? And she knew that my arms were paralyzed. So she reached in and put her hand on my hand. And she started to tell me about how delighted she was that I was alive and everything that she had done to try to save me. Then, Mark, it got very personal. She started to talk about her father, which I thought was, kind of odd. And she said, I'm Hindu and I've got a very spiritual background, and I'm a woman of faith, and my parents were very faithful. And she said, but my father, 6 months before my first son was born, and he was just living to see my son's face, he suddenly died from an aneurysm. And she said, I've been very, very bitter. I've lost my faith. I'm not sure about things anymore. But she said, seeing you here alive gives me hope again. I mean, I've been inspired again, that maybe, just maybe, there really is something out there. And while she was telling me that, it hit me. That voice started to come back in my head, and I said, oh my God, it was her father. Because she went on to tell me how her and her father had this incredible spiritual connection, and they knew what each other was thinking, and she's here, and he lives in Houston, Texas, and he helped her through medical school and all this stuff. So I didn't want to tell her in that moment because I had enough craziness going on, and I said, I'm just going to let it go. So it was a year later, after I couldn't get a heart in North Carolina. We went everywhere, all the heart clinics, and I couldn't get a heart. So I got my heart at the University of Chicago Medicine. And then, you have to live near the hospital for a year because they're responsible for you. If you have a rejection or infection, they'll lose their license for for organ transplant, which is, obviously a big moneymaker for a hospital.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when I came back to North Carolina, and everyone encouraged me to write a book because of all these experiences, I decided that it was going to be kind of like a documentary, and I wanted to interview these 3 doctors that had saved my life. So I went and interviewed Dr. Patel. I went and interviewed Dr. Bajwa, the cardiologist, and I interviewed Dr. Carson, who was the one that intubated me. And it was then that I told Dr. Patel.
What was her reaction? She had to
she flipped out. So we try to talk now every year on her. Well, I've seen her many times. She's in my cell phone, good friends. But we try to talk particularly on her father's birthday every year.
Well, see, that's the nuance of your story that I find fascinating, that all these little rivulets, these little tributaries that all start with the quark that is robbed gentile and radiate out, which when you try to make sense of something this overwhelming, it must be very gratifying to see those types of interactions and how God, consciousness, however you want to characterize the source, interacts with us all if we just listen, right? If we put our ears to our hearts, metaphorically, and you and I have visited, as men, we tend to be more linear and less open. Although nowadays, people, I find, as men, we are more open to these topics, and I'm going to circle back to that in a while. But let's go back now to your traditional or non-traditional NDE, when you code and you go into what you characterize as just the ethereal world. Can you describe the stages of that, and then how you determined that these quarks of light were all individual pieces of consciousness that were manifesting through the Creator?
Yes, for sure. Well, so I died in January of 2016, and I didn't get my heart until June. So there was that whole period. I had atrophied. I'm about 173 pounds now. That's how my weight in high school. I had atrophied down to about 138 pounds. I was just this green skeleton walking around. Before I left the hospital in North Carolina, they had, I was in a defibrillator vest full time that would shock me back every time my heart failed, which was often. So I had a battery pack on my right shoulder with a defibrillator vest, and then that wasn't enough. So they had put a port in my chest, and they were dripping this medicine on my heart every minute called milrinone. So I had another battery pack on my left shoulder, dripping this medicine on my heart. So milrinone, my doctor said, think of it as STP for the heart. It pumps the heart, but the clock starts ticking because it wears the heart out very, very quickly. So when I got to Chicago in April, when I walked through the door, the heart transplant team looked at me and said, "We have no idea how you're walking around, but we'll try to do our best." So there was another doctor there, a very famous heart transplant surgeon, who's still there, by the way. His name is Dr. Juvanandan. Uncharacteristically tall Indian man, one of the most beautiful souls I've ever met in my life. And he came into my room one day and he said, "You know, Rob, I don't think you're going to make it in time for a donor heart to arrive, because it takes a very long time. You're on the A1 list for a certain amount of days, and you're in line for everybody else to get a heart." And he said, "But I've been working on an experimental heart pump called the New Pulse, and it's a counter pulsation device." And he said, "I'll tell you how it works." He said, we'll cut you here, and we'll fish this balloon pump down through your aorta, and out the side of your body, behind your rib cage, will be a titanium disc, and the wires will come out of that disc and connect to this little box about the size of a lunchbox, run by an iPad, and it'll pump your heart for you and keep you alive until your donor heart arrives." And I said, "Doc, that's incredible." I said, "How long has this thing been around? How many people have had this thing?" And he said, "Well, that's just it." He said, we've only experimented on cows and pigs. But he
So
said,
you made medical history then.
I made medical history with the new pulse.
And it wasn't the first time you would make medical history.
Yes, that's right.
That's a tease for later.
Yeah. So so now it's being used all over the country as a bridge to transplant. But what had happened is that, and I don't want to give away everything in the book, but for whoever who wants to read it. But when you go through heart transplant, you go through a rigorous pre-transplant testing. And if they find something in you like cancer or other things, then you're disqualified for transplant because they don't want to waste a heart because they're so valuable. So they did find something in me after I had had the new pulse in me for 3 weeks, which is what they needed to go to the FDA for human trials. So my transplant team came in one afternoon and told me that we're sorry, we had hoped that things had worked out differently, but you can't be transplanted. So it was either that night or shortly afterwards. I was in my room, and I was on the 7th floor of the University of Chicago Medicine, facing Lake Michigan. And when you're up that high, it's kind of like you feel like you're right in the water there. You see the water. And I'll tell you, Mark, it was that one of those dark night of the soul things. This unbelievable storm came whipping up, and this thunder and lightning like I'd never seen, and just sheets of rain smashing against the window. It was dark in there. I was alone. I've got all this stuff hooked up to me, and there it was almost as if this dark energy, this evil force, had come into the room, just kind of like baiting me, reminding me of every mistake that I had ever made in my life, and just weakening me. And just, it continued on and continued on, this negative thinking. And I guess I just worked myself up into, some kind of anxiety, panic attack. And my heart went into tachycardia, and all of the bells and whistles started ringing. And then it happened. And all of a sudden, I found myself standing in the middle of nowhere. And it's kind of interesting because, and in the book, I do call it Into the Ethereal. And I could see myself down in my green hospital gown, this wizened, my brother told me that I looked like an old man with the voice of a child. I'm looking down at this broken body. And at the same time, I can see myself standing in the middle of nowhere, healthy and whole, in the same green, hospital gown. And at first, being a Christian, I remember standing there being very disappointed that I didn't see any angels there. I didn't hear any heavenly music. My parents who had gone before me weren't there to greet me. My grandmother, I didn't see Jesus Christ, which was terribly disappointing to me. I'm like, okay, I'm in the middle of nowhere. I'm standing here, and what's happening? But in that moment, the Creator started to speak into my spirit with concepts that I wholly understood at the moment. Concepts like, I am omnipotent. This is your real identity. This is the source of all consciousness. Things like that started to come to me. And I began to realize that I was in a place where somehow I was connected to divine wisdom and peace and intelligence. And as this evolved, I thought to myself, because the 5 senses had no functionality there. I couldn't smell anything. I couldn't touch anything. I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't taste anything. It was just me standing in the middle of nowhere, kind of like absorbing all this information. And what was so fascinating is that if I wanted to know the answer to any question, all I had to do was think about it. It was kind of like synchronicity and telepathy at the same time. It was just an incredible thing. And the next thing that happened is that I saw, which is the cover of the book, I saw and became part of this incredible web of sparkling lights. And it was kind of like we know what a neuron looks like from science class. It has a nucleus, and then it has, tentacles, and everything is woven together. And this web of lights just seemed to stretch out into infinity and hang on the ceiling of the universe. And I was shown that each little nucleus with this spark of light in it was a quark, and it represented a life. And that a quark, there are many quarks, and they combine to create anything. These quarks can combine, they can create a planet, a person, a dog, a tree, it doesn't matter. And it was shown to me that that's what the Creator uses. The Creator uses light to create, heal, and transform us. And it made so much sense to me in that place. And I remember thinking, oh my God, the recipe is so simple for creation. We're just trying to figure this thing out, but it's that simple. It's one recipe, one Creator. We're all connected. We all come from the same place, and we're all made of light. And of course, science is proving that now. So while I was in that place and I became connected to everything and part of that web, I remember thinking that if I hurt myself, I hurt everything connected to me. But if I loved, that light would spread. And that was, that's just part of that experience. But that was one of the most profound moments. And I thought, loneliness is an illusion then. How can we feel alone and be alone when we're connected to everything? And, sometimes...
I know. Yeah, just real quickly, Anita Morjani has a very good analogy, just what you've articulated. And she talks about, look at the most ornate tapestry in the most beautiful museum in the world. And if you're like right up against it, you can only see the 5 or 6 threads that bind that little patch together. But when you step out like you did and like she did when she had her NDE, she could see everything is inextricably linked to one another.
Absolutely.
So that's the great illustration of what you articulate in your book.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I met her. We were both invited to speak at a conference in Arizona a couple of years ago, and I got to meet Anita. Read her book after, I had my experience and wrote my book, and it was a pleasure to have met her. But I just and this is where I have a difficulty with, the anger and the hatred and the separation and everything that's going on in the world. Because if we all realize that we're all one and we're all connected and we all come from the same place, it would be a different world. And I think that until we get to that place when we realize that we're all one and we're all connected, we will never be able to find peace within ourselves or within our world. And you were talking about, going to Sri Lanka and some of the experiences that you've had, and I've traveled extensively, and people are people. There's really no difference between us all. I mean, culturally, certainly there are differences, but we all have the same blood running through our veins,
Well, there's a caveat that you also talked about and that I am very mindful of, because now that I'm in this space exclusively, and a lot of my friends were saying, yeah, but what about so-and-so? Accountability is huge. You still have to be accountable for your own actions, right? You can't be just annihilating people just because you believe that they're different than you. So how do we reconcile those two facts? Because the media, which I was a part of, albeit in sports many years ago, a lot of it now is clickbait. It's all headlines. They want you to click. That's how they monetize it. That's how they set their rate cards. That's how they make their money.
Yep.
How do we, as people who are talking about the substance and the essence of life, articulate to people that who have reservations because they think some people are just bad, they're unredeemable, or B, how do we get to those people who are perpetrating what we believe are atrocities and really make contact with them so they, come on, stand down. You have that answer? Because if you have that answer, then you're going to sell a lot of books.
Well, I'll tell you, here's what I'd like to back up and talk about. The first thing you brought up is accountability. I'm not looking at the world through Pollyanna, eyes. yes, there's evil in the world. There are bad things that are happening, especially now. There are bad things that have happened throughout the history of humankind. But we have to be accountable for our actions. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that when I was in that web, there were parts of the web that weren't, as bright as others. And while I was there, I looked at that and I said, well, that has to be evil. But then I came to understand that those darker parts of the web were where people were not allowing the love and light of the Creator to express through them. And that was one of the central messages that I got in that place, that the Creator, well, let's start here. We're all spiritual beings having a human experience, period, end of story. We're spiritual beings. And when we don't allow the love and light of the Creator to express through us, then the Creator can't experience life, because the Creator is a spirit. So when I found that out, and when I understood that, and it really began to sink in, then it gives us a little more compassion and empathy for other people, to understand that they may have come from a violent environment, or they may have had things happen to them in their life that make them who they are now. But I'm not saying that should let them off the hook. At the end of the day, we all have to be responsible for our actions. But I have to tell you that these people that are out there committing atrocities and all of these bad things, I believe you can call it karma, you can call it whatever you want. It may not happen in the physical realm, but it's going to happen in the spiritual realm, because that web that I saw is a reflection of what goes on in the spiritual realm and here on earth. It's a mirror, and it represents the light and dark struggle that mankind has been dealing with since the beginning of time. So I don't have the answer to, hey, how do we stop all this and become one and sing kumbaya around a big bonfire? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that it has to start with our own accountability and with the realization that we're all connected. And sometimes, even now, when I feel alone or disconnected, nature helps bring all of that in and helps bring all of that back.
Yeah.
I just go take a nice walk. Actually, it was in Chicago where I began to understand and see the relationship between nature and the Creator. It's a beautiful thing to this, because the trees and the grass, they can't talk back to you, but you can see that their design are very similar. You take a leaf off of a tree and you begin to look at it under a microscope, and it looks like a solar system or a brain. It's all the same.
Well, and you talk about reinvigorating your life with those walks and doing like what we do as children, which I think is a very important point. Children, we don't have these prejudices when we come into life, right? They're accumulated over time, either by our family and or friends or society in general. You talk about just like crushing the leaves up, running around with your bare feet, experiencing nature and the glee and the joy and the satisfaction of it. I think those are very important acts that we can do. But since we have limited time and we could go on forever, we've got to talk about Maria and Molly. Maria is your daughter. That's really touched my heart. I have two girls. And for you to have a special needs daughter, talk about, just the existence of having to cater to all of her needs based on what she's going through physically, but then also the interaction that you had with her on the other side when you met her and said, I've never heard your voice. I don't even know, you've never called me daddy. And the 3 words she said to you just really hit me. I mean, they really did.
Yeah, I hope I can get through it without breaking up. Maria she's actually the hero of the story because, and I always say this, if I hadn't died at age 56, I don't know that I would have ever been able to see Maria as she really is now. And there's a lot of guilt and a lot of internal trauma and a lot of things that I've had to work through in addition to recovering, coming out of heart transplant, because And let's be honest about it. You know, you have a special needs child. Maria has Rett syndrome, which is very rare, only strikes girls. Now they're saying that there could be boys with Rett syndrome, but it's a horrifying disease state where, you know, Maria cannot walk, talk, feed herself. She's total care. But, you know, when you're going through things like this and you have a job to deal with and a family and, you know, a mortgage and all of the things that you deal with in life, you have a tendency to look at a child like that or people like that as a burden. And although there was a part of me and my wife too that we committed to never, ever putting Maria away, never institutionalizing her, because we loved her so much. But nonetheless, you still deal with, particularly after it's been 30 years now, but at that time, you know, you're dealing, it was 20 years when I died, and you're like, gosh, what would life be like without this burden, you know, because
Right.
it's all consuming night and day it's consuming. And as we get older, it gets even tougher, you know. But what had happened to me in that ethereal realm transformed my life and continues to transform my life. And I have come to realize that when you live a life in service, you're getting closer and closer and closer to, you know, that veil, that spiritual life that for years and years and years, I tried to meditate to try to get back up into that ethereal place and could never get there. But now I understand that it's in service to others that actually connects you with that spiritual realm more than anything. And so while I was in that ethereal place, I was, you know, enjoying my time there, understanding, you know, the universe and connecting with everything and all the things that were being shown. And here comes Maria. She came out of that web and she came up to me and she was standing there perfect and whole for the first time in her life. And Rett syndrome girls writhe their hands constantly, but Maria, she said, had her hands to her side and she was perfect. And she had this light emanating through her eyes that it's that spiritual light that animates all life. Again, it's the love and light of God. And there she was standing there. And I said to her, Maria, I have never known how to help you. I've never heard your voice. I've never heard, you know, you say, I love you, Daddy. I said, just tell me what it is that I can do to help ease your suffering, to make life better for you. And she looked at me and she said 3 words that transformed my life and continue to be, you know, the guide in my life. And she said, just love me. And when she said, just love me, I had cried out into that ethereal realm that I never wanted to leave this place. I wanted to stay there with her, see her perfect and whole, and have that peace, and for the first time, see my daughter. And that's when I found myself in my bed, back in my bed.
Well, and I think also that's just unbelievably defining for what life really is. I mean, she is like us. We're all, and people present differently because we get caught up in images, physicality. But like you said, the leaf under a microscope is just vibrating. There's so much life. Everything has life. The character of life is in all of us and in everything. But you also talked about a little bit of a mini life review, which I thought was very powerful, which is where you looked at these nurses, were shown these nurses that you had, you know, maybe thought, yeah, they're not the most helpful or whatever, and made a characterization of them. But then you were shown why they were the way they were, and that was very compelling as well.
That's right. No, I was, you know, hey, we do it all the time.
Yeah, all of us do it.
We do it all the time. We judge people unfairly without knowing. But, you know, in that place, I was able to see those nurses. And I described it as kind of like how the old cartoons were made, you know. Each movement of the character was, you know, drawn, and then you flip the pages quickly and, you know, you create motion. But to me, I saw their lives going backwards, and I saw all the things that were damaging to them and that all the abuse and the suffering and the things that they had gone through, which painted a picture of who they were now and why they were that way. And it gave me the opportunity also to have my own life review and to see the things that I was most ashamed of and the mistakes that I had made in my life. And I thought, wow, I mean, how could I have judged these people so harshly? So
well, but like you said, we all do it, and forgiveness is a part of it. I think that's the educational part of life, is to educate ourselves that when we make those snap judgments in traffic and we flip somebody off, and then we don't realize that lady had just lost her husband earlier that morning, and she was beside herself. She was in a catatonic state. She wasn't responsible for her actions. And then we have to have that illustrated at our time of death. The whole point of this comprehensively, to me, these stories, yours is so nuanced, we won't get to everything, but every moment is important with every sentient being, dogs, cats, people, animals, nature. All of that is important because collectively it makes us who we are in the aggregate. Like you said, we're a particle of God. We are that infinite power, and we can exercise. We're given free will. Nobody puts a gun to our head.
That's
and
right.
That's the beauty of the system. So you can learn, or then you have to learn. And we could get esoteric and talk about multiple dimensions and all those things, but it doesn't make any difference because right now in this moment is the most important moment. And so I'm so delighted that you had the opportunity to see Maria there in her true, pristine spiritual state, which always existed, but to have it quantified to you. And I'm sure Melanie, your wife, said, gosh, I don't want to die, but I wish I would have had an experience.
Oh, absolutely, sure.
Because you even talk about what all of us would think, God, should we put her in an institution? Should we just, I wish she would just go, she's a burden to us. She's a burden to herself. And those are all normal thoughts. That's part of dealing with the whole comprehensive nature of life. And you've at least been shown that it doesn't have to be that way, even though it's arduous, even though you're back in the throes of it right now. You have perspective based on your experience.
Yeah. Well, not only perspective, but it's the driving force. It's the driving force in my life now to get her safely to the other side, so I could, she could be whole in spirit, and I can experience that again. I really do believe that I'll experience that again. And I've come to understand too, Mark, that we make these contracts before we come here. Mm-hmm. I really believe that.
I agree.
There's a phrase that I coined in the book that coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous.
That's a good one.
And I really believe that. I never knew my father, but it's interesting is that the day that I got admitted to the University of Chicago Medicine for heart transplant was the day that he had passed away when I was a child. I mean, all of these different, many, we don't have time to get into them, but it's a long laundry list of coincidences that it was, the whole thing was divinely guided. For whatever reason, my friends call me Lazarus. For whatever reason, I was meant to come back and carry this mission forward, and I'm delighted and honored to do it.
Well, let's wrap this up because I think the part of this, there's so many incredible parts of your story, but the heart donor and then your determination to find who that was, who is now part of me. And so to wrap this up, tell us about Molly, how you found out it was Molly, and how having her heart beat in you based on the way she transitioned has affected her family and you as well.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you, here we go again. So Molly was born 3 months before Maria. So they were both 20 years old at the time. And it took me 2 years to find out who the donor family was. But I got to meet the donor family. I got to meet her best friend, Natalie, who was instrumental in helping me, characterize Molly and all the beautiful things that she was. And when I went to her celebration of life at the graveyard, Natalie and her friends had put together this. Of course, I still have this beautiful picture book of her life, because Molly and Natalie were best friends since they were 5 years old. So I got to see, everything about her. And, it's kind of interesting because when I met her father and we sat down, I met him at a Denny's, and we sat down and we began to talk, and he brought Molly's computer, and he brought, some artifacts and things of her life. And speaking of these coincidences, so he began to show me Molly's artwork. And it was kind of interesting because Molly never took an art lesson. She was a natural born artist, and pencil sketches were her favorite thing. So when he began to show me her artwork, of course, I realized then that everything that I had experienced in the ethereal, everything that was shown to me was real, because my mother, who was an immigrant, was also a natural born artist, and pencil sketches were also her thing. And when I started to look at the art from Molly and my mother's art, it was uncanny how similar they were in many ways, in tone, in what they picked to draw, everything. And then he began to tell me about Molly's favorite flower, which was the daisy. And actually, Molly had a tattoo of some daisies on her shoulder before she transcended. And I don't like to use the word death. I like to use the word transition or transcend. But it turns out that my father, his favorite flower was the daisy. And
you can't make this stuff up.
Can't make this stuff up. And back home in Pennsylvania, there's this iconic picture of my father kneeling in front of his organic garden, which he plowed by hand every year with a shovel, and his beautiful row of daisies. He was in love with, with daisies. So it's, and this is just, many parts of it, as you say, Mark, there's so much more to it, but I'm just trying to give you a quick thumbnail sketch of,
sure.
But what was curious about it is that I began to research while I was in Chicago, because I had to live there a year. And that's where I began to research, these things, part of my book. And I learned a lot about the heart. And a lot of people don't realize that the heart has a brain. So as you can imagine, the heart is one of the very first things that forms in the mother's womb, because it's the heart, of course, that pumps the blood and oxygen and nutrients to the rest of the body to develop the body and the brain. So this relationship between the heart and the brain start at birth. And a lot of the essence of that person, some of their food preferences, their music, their memories, all those things are in that heart brain. And so when somebody like me, you cut my heart out of my chest, throw it in a garbage can, and put somebody else's in there, the essence of that other person begins to express. And I'll tell you how it expresses. There's 3 primary ways that the heart begins to express, because you've got to remember, the heart regulates your sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, hormones, production. All of these things come from the heart. So the heart has to build new pathways to get to the brain so these 2 guys can talk, so you can walk around. And they do it through, neurologically. They begin to communicate. They communicate through hormones, through those pathways, and they begin to communicate through electromagnetic waves, which is incredible. So the heart is 60 times more powerful in its electromagnetic source, and these electromagnetic waves, they come out about 100 feet from our body into a radius, And this is how you had mentioned animals. This is how we communicate with animals without language. It's how we communicate with each other without language. So that's why it's so important. In every religious text, it's all about the heart, the heart, the heart, the heart, right? Mm-hmm. And it's true. And that's why, because the heart, again, they've got this electromagnetic pulse coming out that's stronger than the brain. And when you walk into a room and you see somebody and you say, oh, I don't like that person's energy, it's the heart talking to the other heart. So this is why I talk about in the book, it's incredibly important to be careful what it is that we consume. And this is where bad social media and other things come in, violent movies, all these violent music, all these things come in, because this is being transmitted to others subconsciously. We don't even know that it's going on, but that's what's happening. But it also is what connects us and binds us together, as sentient beings. So it's a fascinating subject that I could go talk about for the next hour. But that's how the essence of another human being starts to express in you. And it's kind of funny because so Molly was addicted to certain things, like, certain foods and things like that. And my wife was like, why are you, I've never known you to eat M&Ms before. You're not a junk food guy. There was a woman on my floor that got transplanted, that she had absolutely no idea why she was craving chocolate milk, to the point where she had to have these nurses go to the floor above and floor below to get chocolate milk. And she actually spoke at one of we used to have a heart transplant kind of like support group in the hospital. And she got to meet her donor family a lot earlier on than I did. And the mother came in to speak to us one day and talked about how her daughter was addicted to chocolate milk. So it's just really fascinating stuff, that there's so much that we don't understand, and mm-hmm. It's so important to have an open mind and open heart to let these things come in.
Well, let's finish up like we usually do. Can you impart, based on the totality of your experience, to people who have had nothing resembling that and live in this chaos that we've delineated quite a few times on this show? What are some of the features of your experience that you integrate into your life that we could all do? And I know one of them is going to be testify. I just know that, because service is paramount. And I agree with that too. If I get into the day and say, how can I serve? I always have a better day.
Oh my goodness.
I always have a better day.
Service is paramount to us becoming more empathetic and more compassionate to each other. Connecting with nature, meditating, praying. If I start my day, I try to start my day, depending on when Maria gets up, but I try to start my day every morning in gratitude, being grateful for everything that I have, being grateful to be alive, being grateful to serve, being grateful to work, being grateful to, be a father, a brother, or, all of these things. Gratitude, the power of gratitude is an amazing, amazing thing.
I agree 100%.
So gratitude, because particularly at a time when everybody it's all about me, and what can I accumulate? And my goodness, that's old, tired thinking. I mean, now it should be about, because time is so precious, how can I give back? What is it that I can do for others? How can I serve? Maria's taught me that. And that's when you really get to experience love, because what it does is it pushes the ego out of the way. The ego is very destructive. So it just kind of like pushes the ego out of the way long enough for you to experience that love with other people and that connection with other people. And it's astounding what happens when you do that. I try to spend as much time as I can, even at work. I'll take a break and I'll take a walk and realize that, hey, there might be a problem now, but it'll get handled and it's going to go away, and it's all good. Realizing that we're spiritual beings first, and that it's going to end. So like you said, be grateful to be alive, enjoy every moment, be the best person that you can be. All of these things, Mark, they may sound basic, but they're accumulative.
Right.
They're accumulative.
You aggregate them all together, and collectively they're very, very strong ways to overcome what might appear to be reality, but really isn't reality.
Yeah, that's right.
Listen, I know you got to go. I appreciate your time. I look forward to doing this again, and we can get, I think, deeper into just what an incredible impact that your life, your story, the courage to tell it, and also Molly's family, the solace that they got from knowing that their daughter is still alive in you. A portion of her is the impetus for your heart beating. Because we live for our kids. You live for Maria, and your wife, Melanie. Give her our love and blessings, because this has not been easy for her either. I mean,
No.
to go through this and not only be a mother, but be a wife, and then to have to go through all of this herself and your family. You talk about your brothers and, how everybody was unified in getting you. We didn't even talk about the Chinese minister who refocused your thoughts. So that's a good tease for the next show.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd be delighted to talk about that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And where can people get a hold of you if they would like to contact you?
To my website, and it's real simple. It's robagentile.com. robagentile.com. They can email me and message me through that.
Or the book.
They can get my book on Amazon, and my website and information is on there as well.
We'll put it in the show notes as well, Rob. Grateful that you stopped by. And if you're ever out in these parts for an ION summit or something, or even fun, just let me buy you a meal or a beer or both.
I'd love to do that. Absolutely.
Okay. You take care. Thanks for
Thank
visiting.
you so much. Thanks for having me, Mark. It's been wonderful.